The night of the Hargrove Foundation Gala, nobody spoke to the little boy in the corner. He was 7, maybe 8, and he sat in a gilt chair near the coat check with his hands folded in his lap, wearing a navy blazer that was slightly too large for his shoulders. The sleeves came down past his wrists. Someone had tried to roll them up, but they'd slid back down again, and now he just sat there, watching the room the way a child watches an aquarium, with that particular stillness that comes from knowing the glass is between you and everything else. Audrey Colborne noticed him the moment she walked in. She noticed him because she'd been that child once. Not deaf, not in a blazer, not at a fundraiser in a ballroom on the 42nd floor of a building overlooking the Harper in Halifax. But still, in all the ways that mattered, she had been exactly that child. Sitting somewhere she wasn't supposed to be, waiting for an adult who'd forgotten they'd brought her. She took a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray and told herself it wasn't her business. The Hargrove Foundation Gala was the kind of event Audrey attended every year because her firm, a mid-sized architectural practice with a decent reputation and a better client list, expected her to. She was 34 years old, recently made partner, and still sometimes surprised to find herself in rooms like this one, with their ceilings that made you feel small in a good way, and their flower arrangements that cost more than her first car. She wore the same dark navy dress she'd worn the year before and hoped no one remembered. The trick to these evenings, she'd learned, was to find one person to talk to genuinely and spend the rest of the time looking purposeful while circling the food station. She circled the food station twice. She spoke to a client she liked and 2 colleagues she didn't particularly. She accepted a refill she didn't need. She watched the little boy. He hadn't moved in 40 minutes. People flowed around him the way water moves around a rock, not ignoring him exactly, more like failing to see him. A woman in emerald silk walked past him 3 times. A waiter set a fresh napkin on the table beside him and didn't look at his face. 2 men in suits stood 6 feet away arguing about interest rates, and the boy watched them with the same calm, unreadable expression he'd been wearing since Audrey arrived. She would have left it alone. She genuinely would have. Except that at some point she caught his eye by accident and he didn't look away. He just looked at her. Steadily and directly, the way children do before they've been taught that it's rude to stare. And there was something in that look that was not sadness exactly, not the kind that asks to be fixed. It was more like patience, like he'd been waiting a very long time and had gotten reasonably good at it. Audrey set down her glass. She walked over, and when she reached the gilt chair, she did something she hadn't consciously planned. She crouched down, balancing on the balls of her feet so she was eye level with him rather than standing over him. It just seemed like the obvious thing to do. "Hi," she said. "I'm Audrey." He watched her mouth when she spoke. Then he raised one hand and made a small, careful gesture she didn't recognize, and something rearranged itself in her understanding of the situation. She'd been around deaf people exactly twice in her life. Her grandmother's neighbor's son, briefly, when she was about 12, and a colleague's wife at a dinner party years ago. She knew almost no sign language. She knew the alphabet, slowly and imperfectly, because she'd learned it in a weekend of insomnia 2 winters ago from a YouTube video she'd found by accident. She spelled out her name, letter by letter, getting the E wrong the first time and having to backtrack. The boy's face changed. Not dramatically. It wasn't a movie moment. It wasn't the sunlight breaking through clouds. It was smaller than that. It was the difference between a door that's closed and a door that's slightly open. He spelled something back, too fast for her to follow, and then seemed to understand from her expression that she'd lost it, and slowed down. "Harper, Harper," she said. She tapped her chest. "Audrey." She pointed at him. "Harper." He nodded once. She sat down on the floor beside his chair. Her dress was not designed for sitting on floors, and she was aware in a peripheral way that several people in her immediate vicinity had noticed this and found it puzzling. But she found she didn't particularly care. Harper was looking at her with that same evaluating steadiness, and she got the sense that whatever she said next mattered. She raised her eyebrows in the universal expression that means so. "What do you think of all this?" and gestured broadly at the room. Harper looked around at the chandelier, the flower arrangements, the circling crowd, the platters of food nobody was actually eating. He looked back at her. He made a gesture she didn't know, then seemed to think about it, then deliberately shaped his hands into something she recognized from the video, possibly. Something in the vicinity of boring. Audrey laughed, a real laugh surprised out of her, and Harper's expression shifted into something that might, in better lighting, be called a smile. They stayed like that for a while. She didn't try to make conversation beyond what they could manage with her 30 words of fingerspelling and his evident patience with her slowness. She asked him, laboriously, if he was hungry, and he shook his head. She pointed at the flowers and raised her eyebrows, and he looked at them seriously for a moment, and then held up 2 fingers, which she interpreted as 2 out of 10, and which made her laugh again. She didn't know how much time had passed when she heard someone approach. "I'm sorry, is he bothering you?" The voice belonged to a man who was clearly trying to look like he wasn't hurrying and failing at it. He was perhaps 40, with the particular kind of tired that isn't physical, but lives somewhere behind the eyes, and he was looking at Audrey with an expression that contained several emotions at once: relief, embarrassment, and something that looked almost like shame. Audrey stood up. Her knees protested. "Not at all," she said. "I'm Audrey Colborne. I've been keeping Harper company." "Yes, I can see that, He stopped. He looked at Harper, and Harper looked back at him with an expression that Audrey couldn't quite read. "I'm Noah Aldridge. Harper is my nephew. I shouldn't have. I lost track of time, and my sister is going to." He stopped again. "Thank you. Really? He's great," Audrey said and meant it. Noah Aldridge crouched down the way Audrey had, eye level, and signed something to Harper quickly. Harper signed back. Noah signed again. And there was a brief exchange that Audrey could tell was partly apologetic on Noah's side, and something more complicated on Harper's. Then Harper looked at Audrey and spelled something slowly, clearly for her benefit. NICE. Audrey pressed a hand to her chest in exaggerated flattery. Harper did smile then, properly, finally, and the whole room felt fractionally warmer. She ran into Noah Aldridge twice more that evening, which in a room of 200 people was either coincidence or something else. The first time was at the bar, where they both reached for water at the same moment, and both insisted the other go first, with equal stubbornness, until a bartender settled it by handing them each a glass simultaneously. Noah had found someone to sit with Harper near the window, a woman in her 60s who turned out to be his aunt, Harper's great-aunt, and he'd come back looking slightly less haunted than he had when Audrey first saw him. "He's been here before," Noah said by way of explanation. "To events like this, he manages. He turned the glass in his hand. I was talking to someone, and when I looked up he'd moved, and there were about 10 minutes where I couldn't find him, and I thought—" "You thought the worst," Audrey said, "every single time." "Yes." She understood that. She didn't have children, but she'd had younger siblings, and she'd had the specific cold water terror of looking away for a moment and then looking back to nothing. "He seemed okay," she said. "Patient. He's very—" She paused, looking for the right word. "Present. He was just watching everything." "He does that." Noah looked out across the room toward where Harper was sitting with the aunt. "He's been watching everything since he was about 2 years old. His mum says he processes the world differently, and she means it in the best possible way because she's his mum and she genuinely means it that way. But I think it's also just literally true. He takes everything in. He doesn't miss anything." Audrey thought about those dark, steady eyes. "I believe it." The second time was near the exit, around 10, when she was collecting her coat, and he appeared in the line 3 people behind her, Harper asleep against his shoulder with the boneless absolute trust of children in sleep. She gestured at the sleeping boy and made a face, impressive, and Noah smiled, which rearranged his face in a way she hadn't seen yet, and she thought, "Oh, so that's what that looks like." They walked out at the same time, because the coat room line deposited them at the same door, and there were taxis out front, and it was the end of October in Halifax, which meant the wind had teeth, and Noah Aldridge shifted his sleeping nephew to a more secure position against his shoulder and said, "He wanted me to tell you something before he crashed out. He'd practiced spelling it, which, he made me check it 3 times. What was it?" Noah looked slightly self-conscious in a way that sat oddly with his otherwise composed face. "He said to tell you. Best grown-up at the party." Audrey felt something move in her chest that she wasn't going to examine too closely standing on a windy sidewalk. "Tell him he's my pick for best person overall," she said. Noah's taxi came. He got Harper settled in the back seat, buckled and tucked, and then he stood for a moment in the open door with the wind pulling at his jacket and looked at her with that complicated expression again. "Colborne," he said. "Audrey Colborne." "Aldridge," she said. "Noah Aldridge." He smiled again, smaller this time, just at the corner, and got in the cab. She stood on the sidewalk in the October wind for a moment longer than was necessary before she found her own. She told herself she wasn't thinking about him, and managed to believe it for about 3 days. On the 4th day, she was in a meeting about a mixed-use development in Dartmouth, listening to a client explain why he wanted to modify the structural plan in a way that would cost twice as much and solve nothing. And she found herself thinking about the way Noah Aldridge had looked when he finally found his nephew. That wash of relief so immediate and unguarded it hadn't had time to arrange itself into something more presentable. She found herself thinking about Harper spelling nice for her, slowly and carefully, in her direction, so she'd understand. She was thinking about it so clearly that she almost missed the moment her client said her name. "Mrs. Colborne, does that work for you?" "No," she said on instinct, and then had to walk it back slightly when it turned out she'd agreed and then disagreed with the same proposal within 90 seconds. Her business partner, Yemi, caught up with her in the hallway after. "Where were you in there?" "I was there," Audrey said. "I said no. You said yes first. I corrected it." Yemi looked at her with the specific look of a friend who has known you for 11 years and is deciding whether to ask questions. She decided not to. Audrey was grateful. She was less grateful 3 days after that when Yemi forwarded her an email with the subject line, "You might know this person," and no other text. And the email was from a Noah Aldridge, who was apparently on the board of a heritage conservation group that Audrey's firm had done work for 2 years prior, and who had written to inquire, very correctly, very professionally, whether Miss Colborne might be available for a consultation regarding a potential project. She stared at the email for a long time. She wrote 3 different replies, deleted 2 of them, and sent the third, which was businesslike and calm, and contained absolutely no indication that she'd spent the last week thinking about the look on his face on a sidewalk in October. He wrote back the same evening. The email was businesslike. It was also 3 paragraphs longer than it needed to be, she noticed. The consultation was at a coffee place on Barrington Street on a Thursday in November, when the city had gone grey in that specific maritime way that either oppresses you or you learn to love, and Audrey had learned to love it because she'd grown up here. And the alternative was grief. Noah was already there when she arrived. He had 2 coffees and a folder and a look on his face that she'd come to recognize as his default expression, the slightly guarded one that had something warmer underneath it. "I wasn't sure how you take it," he said about the coffee. The woman at the counter made a recommendation. What was the recommendation? "Oat milk flat white. That's exactly how I take it." Something eased in his face. "Good. Lucky guess." The project was real. A former textile building in the North End that a private developer wanted to convert into residential units, and the Heritage Conservation Group was angling for protected status. And they needed someone who could produce a structural assessment that would hold up to scrutiny. It was the kind of work Audrey was good at and found genuinely interesting, the archaeology of old buildings. The way they held their history in their bones if you knew how to read it. They talked about the building for 40 minutes and then kept talking after the work part ran out, which neither of them acknowledged for a while. She asked about Harper. "He's good," Noah said, and the word good carried several things with it. Relief, ongoing vigilance, love of a specific steady kind. He started at a new school in September. The transition it was hard, actually. A few weeks of hard. But he's settled now, I think. Does he like it? He hasn't told his mother he hates it, which is a significant improvement on the previous school. Audrey smiled. That's a data point. His mother, my sister Claudia, she treats everything as a data point. She's a researcher. She approaches Harper scientifically, which sounds colder than it is. She just means she pays attention to every signal. That doesn't sound cold at all, Audrey said. No, he looked at his coffee. No, it isn't. She thought about Harper spelling nice for her, about the slowness of it, the deliberateness, the way he'd checked Noah's work 3 times before letting him deliver it. What did he think of the gala? She asked. After? When you got home, Noah looked up. He talked about you, he said. Or signed about you, I should say. To Claudia, when I got him home. She texted me after to ask who you were. What did you tell her? I told her you were someone who sat on the floor with him for half an hour and learned finger spelling on the spot. I didn't learn it on the spot. I already knew the alphabet very badly. He didn't mention the very badly part. There was a warmth in his voice now, unhidden. He mentioned that you spelled your name wrong and then fixed it, and that you asked him if he was hungry. Those feel like low bars. They're not, actually. He said it simply, without making it a speech. Most people don't try at all. They see the hearing aid, or they figure out something's different, and then they just stop engaging. Which is fine, I understand why, but he notices. He always notices. Of course he does, Audrey said. He notices everything. Noah looked at her for a moment. Yes, he said. He does. She took a sip of her oat milk flat white. Outside, November rain was starting against the glass and the grey street was going greyer. I learned it from a YouTube video, she said. The finger spelling. 2 in the morning, insomnia. I learned the whole alphabet and then basically never used it. Until now. That, he said, and stopped and started again. That's a good coincidence. I'm starting to think so, she said. She had dinner with Noah Aldridge 6 weeks later, which she told Yemi about in the same tone she used when describing a particularly good structural assessment. And Yemi looked at her for a very long time and then said, Audrey, what just, Audrey? That's not a sentence. I don't need it to be a sentence. You know what I mean? The dinner was at a small Italian place in the South End that Noah had chosen because, he explained, it was quiet enough to talk. And the way he said it, she understood that he meant quiet enough without caveats, without the specific effort that some places required. She wondered if Harper had a place in that calculus somewhere and thought probably yes. Over pasta she found out. Noah worked in heritage architecture. He had been doing so for 12 years. When he described the textile building on Barrington, his face did something that wasn't quite animation but was something adjacent to it. A kind of attention that switched on fully when the subject mattered. His sister Claudia was indeed a researcher. Neuropsychology, based in Fredericton. Harper spent half the year with Claudia and half with their parents in Halifax, and Noah saw him as often as he could, which was frequently. He's your person, Audrey said. Noah looked slightly caught. Is it that obvious? The way you talk about him? She turned her wine glass. You say his name differently than everything else. Differently how? She thought about it. Like you're being careful with it. He was quiet for a moment. The restaurant made gentle noise around them. He doesn't have. He stopped and started again. He has people. He has Claudia and he has my parents and he has his school now, where there are some kids who, yes, he has people. But I think he needed someone outside the immediate radius. Someone who thought he was just interesting. Not a challenge or a diagnosis or a project. Just a kid worth talking to. He is, Audrey said. Genuinely interesting, I know. Noah smiled. He described you to Claudia using 3 signs, which is his version of elaborate. She texted me asking if you were a real person. What were the 3 signs? The first one was kind. He paused. The second one was funny. And the third one, Claudia said she hadn't seen him use before. What was it? She thinks it's his own word. A sign he made up. She couldn't find it in any dictionary. Audrey waited. She said it looked like. He made a shape with his hands that she didn't know. Something in the vicinity of worth it. As in, worth the effort. Worth trying. She kept her face very still. He doesn't give that one out easily, Noah said. And he was looking at her steadily now, and the noise of the restaurant had receded to something distant and pleasant. According to Claudia, he's given it to maybe 4 people in his life. Audrey pressed her hands flat on the table and breathed in slowly through her nose. Tell him, she said when she trusted her voice, that he's at the very top of my list. Noah looked at her across the restaurant table, with the wine between them and the November dark outside, and the pasta cooling slightly in both their bowls, and something in his expression opened, not dramatically. Not all at once, just enough. Like a door that was closed and now was slightly open. I'll tell him, he said. She met Claudia Aldridge in January, at Claudia's parents' kitchen in Halifax on a Sunday afternoon. And Harper was there too. And he saw her come through the door and stopped absolutely still for 3 full seconds before crossing the room to her with enormous dignity and deliberate slowness and spelling. At approximately his fastest pace, something she had to ask him to repeat twice. You came back. I came back, she said, out loud, and in fingerspelling simultaneously. The E in the right place this time. He assessed this confirmation with the gravity of a small professor. Then he turned and went back to whatever he'd been doing at the kitchen table, which appeared to involve a very complicated arrangement of colored cards, and Audrey watched him settle back into his work and thought, there it is. That's the thing. That still point at the center of everything, the quality of his attention when he was looking at what mattered. Claudia, beside her, said quietly, he practiced spelling that sentence for 3 days. Audrey couldn't speak for a moment. From across the kitchen, Noah looked at her and didn't say anything, because he didn't need to. He'd learned that about her by then. She didn't need things wrapped up and explained. She just needed them acknowledged. And he was, it turned out, very good at acknowledgement. Later, at the kitchen table with hot coffee and Claudia, asking questions that were researcher questions but also sister questions, and Harper arranging his cards with the steady focus of someone who knew exactly what he was doing, and the January light coming in pale and cold through the window. Audrey thought about coincidence, about 2 in the morning YouTube videos, and a gilt chair in a ballroom, and a child's patience and a sidewalk in October. She thought about doors that are slightly open. She thought, worth it.